A woman cried at his funeral and then tried to sell our house. She claimed she was family, but I had never seen her before in my life. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The church smelled of lilies, the pews were filled with familiar faces, and my heart ached seeing my husband's casket at the front, draped in his favorite blue blanket. Then she came in. Her tears flowed freely, her hands shook as she reached for mine. "I'm the only family he had left," she said, her voice quivering. But something didn't feel right. Why did her eyes seem too rehearsed? Why did her sobs echo too loudly, as if performed for everyone watching? From that moment, our quiet, ordinary life began to twist into something I could never have imagined. Subscribe now, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. Stories her heart holds. After the funeral, the woman lingered longer than anyone else. Most people had offered their condolences, given a quiet hug, and then returned to their lives. But she stayed by the church steps, staring at me with those wide, glistening eyes. I felt trapped between politeness and instinct. Something about her made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I need to speak to you about the house," she said, her voice trembling. "He told me it would be mine someday." I blanked. My husband had never mentioned anyone by that name. We'd lived in our home for decades, raised our children here, and every relative I knew was accounted for. I opened my mouth to correct her, but she placed a hand on my arm, soft and urgent. "Please," she said, "I just want what's rightfully ours." The first seeds of unease were planted. Later that evening, I told my daughter-in-law, Margaret, about the woman. "She's a stranger," I said, gripping my teacup so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I don't know who she is, and now she's claiming the house." Margaret frowned, adjusting her glasses. "Mom, do you think she's lying?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice low. "But something doesn't feel right. She knew things, but not in the way someone who truly knew him would." Still, I couldn't shake the image of her crying so convincingly in the chapel. It had been heartfelt enough to fool anyone who wasn't paying close attention. And at first, I wanted to believe her. My husband had always been kind to everyone. Maybe there was some distant relative I'd forgotten. Maybe I was just being suspicious. The next day, she appeared again, this time at our front door. I had hoped I wouldn't see her, but there she was, holding a folder, wearing a long coat despite the spring warmth. "She brought the documents," she said. Her eyes glistened as though she had cried all night. She handed me the folder. "Everything he promised me, everything he left behind." I hesitated, my hands trembling as I opened the folder. Inside were papers, signatures that seemed genuine at first glance, and letters that spoke of memories I didn't recall sharing with anyone. She had a way of inserting herself into my life, filling the gaps with details that sounded personal but weren't quite right. I spent hours that evening poring over the papers. Something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The signatures looked authentic, but I didn't recognize the handwriting. The letters mentioned childhood memories that didn't match anything I knew. My husband had been meticulous with his personal records. He wouldn't leave anything like this to chance. Margaret sat beside me, her brow furrowed. "Mom, maybe we should call a lawyer," she suggested, "just to be safe." I nodded slowly. A small part of me, the part that loved trusting people, wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. But another part, a deeper, more cautious part, whispered that something was wrong. The next few days, the woman's visits became more frequent. She asked questions about the house, about our routines, about minor repairs we had planned. She seemed friendly enough, but there was an edge to her politeness, a way of studying me that made my stomach twist. It was as if she was memorizing my life, preparing for something I couldn't yet see. One afternoon, she asked to see the basement. "She just wants to make sure the plumbing is safe," she said, smiling. I hesitated at first, then nodded, thinking it was a reasonable request. She walked slowly, taking her time to examine every corner. When she finally left, I felt exhausted, as though I had been running a marathon. Then came the phone call. A lawyer representing a distant estate office claimed the woman had paperwork indicating she was my husband's widow. The voice on the other end of the line was polite but firm. "We have documents here that name her as a beneficiary of your husband's estate," he said. "Legally, she has a claim." I felt my hands go cold. "But she isn't. She can't be," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know her." He sighed. "Sometimes family connections are complicated, ma'am. It would be wise to verify the documents with a professional. We can't proceed without due diligence." That night, I sat alone in the living room staring at the fireplace. The house felt smaller somehow, the shadows longer. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining her walking through the rooms, touching things that weren't hers, claiming a life she had no right to. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, but also the more afraid. The next morning, I decided to act. I called a private investigator I had met years ago through a friend. His name was Frank Delaney, a man with sharp eyes and a reputation for uncovering truths that others overlooked. When Frank arrived, I handed him the folder. "I don't know who she is," I said. "I need to know if any of this is real." Frank nodded, opening the papers with practiced ease. "We'll start with the signatures and the documents, then we'll see who this woman really is." He spent days investigating. He checked public records, birth certificates, old family photos, even social media traces. Each time, I hoped for a simple explanation, a lost relative, a misunderstanding, but every lead twisted into another dead end. Finally, Frank called me with news that made my stomach turn. "Ma'am, she's an impostor," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We have no legal connection to your husband. The documents are forged, and she's been using multiple aliases in different towns." I couldn't believe it. My hands shook as I held the phone. "But the funeral," I whispered. "She cried. She acted like she loved him." "People can be convincing," Frank said, "especially when they want something badly enough." The next week was a blur of lawyers, police reports, and confrontations. The woman tried to maintain her story, her voice rising with desperation, but the evidence against her was undeniable. Fingerprints on the forged papers, inconsistencies in her story, proof she had been living under other names, all of it stacked like a mountain. When the case went public, the community of Willow Creek was shocked. People had seen her at the funeral, had whispered about how tragic her story was, how courageous she seemed. But now she was exposed for what she really was, a con artist exploiting grief to claim what wasn't hers. Despite the humiliation she faced, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that our home, our life, and our memories were safe. Sorrow that someone could pretend so convincingly that grief could be used as a tool for deception. Margaret held my hand as we walked through the house. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked. "I am now," I said softly. "It's over, but I will never forget the lesson. Trust, once shaken, is hard to rebuild, and sometimes even the most convincing tears can hide the coldest intentions." In the following months, our lives slowly returned to normal. Friends and neighbors were supportive, and the story of the impostor became a cautionary tale in town. People who had doubted me at first apologized, and I realized that my instincts had been right all along. I often sit in the living room looking at the photos of my husband, remembering the life we shared, the love we built. The house is quiet again, filled with memories and laughter, not deceit. And I carry the knowledge that even in moments of unimaginable loss, clarity and truth can shine through. But sometimes, when the wind rustles the curtains or the phone rings unexpectedly, I catch myself glancing at the door, half expecting her to return. And I remind myself, she may have tried to take what wasn't hers, but she will never take the life, the love, or the memories my family built together. After the shock of discovering that the woman at my husband's funeral was a fraud, I thought the ordeal would settle. I imagined her slipping away quietly, embarrassed and defeated. But she didn't. Instead, her visits grew more insistent, her messages more urgent, and her presence more threatening. It started with phone calls. At first, they were polite, soft-spoken reminders that she needed to discuss the house. Then they became sharper, each one carrying a subtle edge that made my chest tighten. "We can resolve this quickly," she said one evening. "You wouldn't want things to get complicated, would you?" Her tone was calm, almost sweet, but it was unmistakably a threat. I remember clutching the phone, my hands trembling. "Who do you think you are?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "My husband is gone. This house, this life belongs to my family, not you." Her silence hung on the line for a long moment before she finally spoke. "You'll see," she said. "You'll see everything can change if you don't cooperate." I hung up, feeling a cold panic creep into my bones. This was no longer just a claim to property. She was deliberately trying to intimidate me. Margaret insisted I call the police. We had filed reports already, but they had only warned her once. Now it was time for more serious action. Officer Green, a man I trusted from years of neighborhood watch meetings, came to the house to discuss a restraining order. He looked concerned, but his face carried the calm authority that made me feel safer. "We'll make sure she stays away," he said. Despite the reassurance, I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the house sounded like her footsteps. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. I went from room to room, checking locks, securing windows, and praying silently that she would finally disappear. But she didn't. One morning, a letter arrived addressed to me in elegant handwriting. It had no stamp, no return address, just my name and our street. Inside, a single sheet of paper read, "You can't hide forever. He wanted me to have what is mine." The message was short, but the implication was clear. She was watching, waiting, and she wasn't going anywhere quietly. It was then that Frank, my private investigator, suggested a more definitive step, a DNA test. "If she's really related," he said, "we'll know, and if she's not, then you'll have the proof you need." I agreed, my hands shaking as I provided a sample. Margaret watched over my shoulder, squeezing my hand with quiet support. The tension in the room was thick, but it was the kind of tension that pushes you to act, to take control of a situation that feels entirely out of your hands. Meanwhile, the woman's public behavior grew bolder. She appeared at our local grocery store, pretending to browse but clearly scanning for me. Neighbors began to notice. Whispers spread, and though many sympathized with me, a few were skeptical. "Maybe she's really family," they murmured. "You never know." Their doubts stung, but I clung to my instincts, knowing that something was wrong. Then came the confrontation that changed everything. She arrived at the house one afternoon while I was tending to the garden. I froze as I saw her approaching, holding a thick folder of papers and a small camera. "I just want to talk," she said, her voice sweet but sharp. "You can make this easy." I felt a surge of anger. "You've lied, manipulated, and threatened my family," I said. "You are not welcome here." Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You think you can stop me," she said. "I've planned this carefully. You can't prove I'm not who I say I am, not yet." At that moment, Frank arrived. He had been tracking her movements and arrived just in time. His presence made her hesitate, and for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker in her eyes. Over the next few days, Frank's investigation intensified. He uncovered more of her past, previous towns, other aliases, reports of similar schemes. Every revelation was like peeling away a layer of a carefully constructed mask. She wasn't just lying about being my husband's family, she had been living a life built on deceit for years. The DNA results arrived on a gray, rainy afternoon. Margaret and I sat at the kitchen table, gripping each other's hands tightly. Frank slid the envelope across the table. "This will settle it once and for all," he said. I opened it slowly, heart pounding. The results were clear. No relation. My husband's bloodline did not match hers in any way. Relief flooded me, followed quickly by a wave of anger. She had tried to steal our life, and we had proof that she was a fraud. Armed with the evidence, we returned to the police. Officer Green and his colleagues coordinated with the local district attorney, preparing a case against the woman for forgery, fraud, and intimidation. Each step of the legal process felt heavy but necessary. Every paper filed, every statement given was a small victory in reclaiming our peace of mind. When the case finally went to court, the atmosphere was tense. The courtroom was filled with neighbors, family, and curious townspeople. The woman entered confidently, but she could not hide the flicker of fear in her eyes. Her lawyer tried to maintain a strong front, but the evidence, documents, DNA results, and Frank's testimony were overwhelming. The judge listened carefully as each detail of the woman's deception unfolded. Her tears, her sobs at the funeral, her claims to the house, they were all exposed as lies. The courtroom murmured with shock and disbelief. People who had once thought she might be genuine now realized the depth of her deceit. Finally, the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts. The woman's face drained of color as the sentence was read aloud. She was ordered to pay restitution, face legal penalties, and cease all contact with our family. Public humiliation was severe. Her reputation, which she had built on lies, was irreparably damaged. The aftermath was a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and reflection. Friends and neighbors offered support, and slowly our home began to feel safe again. The trust in our community, though shaken, was restored, and I learned something profound. Instincts matter. Sometimes the quiet voice inside you, the one that senses when something is off, is your most reliable guide. I often think back to that first day at the funeral, to her tears and her words. I remember the shock, the fear, and the disbelief, but I also remember the strength it took to protect my family and my home, to uncover the truth, and to face a con artist head-on. In the end, justice was served. The woman could no longer manipulate or threaten anyone. The house remained ours, filled with love, memories, and laughter. And though the experience left scars, it also reinforced the bond between Margaret and me, between our family and our friends, and between truth and those who are brave enough to defend it. Sometimes when the wind rustles through the trees outside our home, or a neighbor waves from across the street, I remember how close we came to losing everything to a stranger, and I remind myself, vigilance, courage, and trust in your own instincts are worth more than gold. Life in Willow Creek slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The shadows of deception faded, replaced by the warmth of genuine community and the reassurance that our lives could not be stolen by lies. And while I carry the memory of that woman's intrusion, it serves as a constant reminder that truth, once uncovered, has a power that no deceit can overcome. After the courtroom verdict, the house finally felt quiet again, but life wasn't immediately the way it had been before the impostor arrived. Willow Creek is a small town where everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. Word of the woman's deceit spread quickly, and while most of our neighbors offered comforting words, there were whispers. "Do you think she could have been family?" some would ask in passing, lowering their voices. Others shook their heads. "I can't believe anyone would stoop so low," they said, glancing at us with sympathy and curiosity. Margaret and I learned to navigate these half-whispered conversations carefully. It was strange how, even after the truth had been proven, a small seed of doubt lingered in people's minds. I understood it. The woman had been so convincing, so meticulous in her lies. For a moment, she had almost rewritten our history. One sunny afternoon, as I sat on the porch sipping tea, Mrs. Harlan from 2 doors down came over, holding a basket of freshly baked cookies. She smiled gently. "I wanted to check on you," she said. "I know what you went through, and I'm glad it's over." I smiled back, feeling the warmth of genuine care. "Thank you, Mrs. Harlan. It's been difficult, but we're getting there." She settled into a chair beside me, leaning forward. "You handled it so well," she said. "Most people would have crumbled under that kind of pressure." I shook my head. "I didn't do it alone. Margaret, Frank, the police, they all helped. I just had to trust what I felt in my heart." Our lives began returning to a slower, calmer rhythm, though the shadow of the impostor lingered in memory. I often reflected on how she had inserted herself into our lives so quickly, so convincingly. Her tears at the funeral, the way she memorized our routines, her confident claims, it had all seemed so real, yet none of it was. Not a single word, not a single gesture. The house, which had felt heavy and invaded, slowly became our sanctuary again. Margaret took up gardening in the backyard, planting tulips and daisies where shadows of doubt had once lingered. I spent mornings cleaning and organizing the rooms, taking care to put our memories back in order. Every photograph, every letter, every piece of memorabilia became a reassurance that our lives had not been stolen. Friends and neighbors gradually returned to visiting, offering tea, sharing stories, and simply being present. Children played in the yard, their laughter spilling into the open air. It was a sound I had missed more than I realized, a sound that reminded me life was continuing even after fear and betrayal. One evening, I found myself flipping through the letters the impostor had left behind, the ones filled with memories that weren't hers. I felt a mixture of anger and sadness. How can someone fabricate such intimacy? How can they pretend so convincingly? I set the letters aside, deciding they would not have a place in our home. Instead, I would remember my husband's true words, our real memories, and the love that had shaped our lives. Margaret came into the room, noticing the letters on the table. She smiled gently. "It's good to let them go," she said. "They belong to a story that never existed." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes," I said softly, "and we'll keep our story, our life, our memories." Even as we rebuilt, I knew I had learned a hard lesson about trust. It's not that I would become suspicious of everyone, but I realized that instincts matter. When something feels off, when your gut tells you to pause and question, it's worth listening. I had learned that in the most painful way possible, but it had saved my family from losing everything. The community slowly regained its sense of normalcy too. People who had once been hesitant to speak to me, unsure of the truth, now approached with warmth and reassurance. Willow Creek is a place where everyone watches out for one another, and the story of the impostor became a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children, neighbors discussed vigilance, and everyone admired how I handled the ordeal with dignity. One afternoon, as I walked through the local park, I ran into Mrs. Kendrick, another longtime friend. "I can't imagine how you felt," she said. "Seeing someone try to take what is yours, someone pretending to be your family, it's unthinkable." I smiled faintly, letting the memory pass through me. "It was frightening," I admitted, "but it also reminded me that love, truth, and integrity can't be stolen, not really." Margaret and I began talking more openly about the experience, sharing our feelings and fears, and reinforcing our bond. She had been my anchor throughout the entire ordeal, her calm presence and unwavering support helping me face each challenge with courage. We also took steps to ensure that our home, our memories, and our lives were protected. Important documents were stored safely, and we discussed measures to prevent anyone from ever attempting such a scheme again. It wasn't about paranoia, it was about safeguarding what was ours. As the weeks turned into months, I began to see the impostor less of a threat and more of a lesson. She had shown me that even in a world filled with good people, deceit can emerge in the most convincing forms. And while her actions were cruel, they had also revealed the strength within me and within my family. I started writing letters to friends and relatives, sharing our experience, in the hope that others could learn from it. I wrote about the importance of instincts, the value of documentation, and the need to trust but verify. I wrote about the courage it takes to face someone who manipulates grief, and the relief of reclaiming your life once truth prevails. The letters were met with gratitude. Friends expressed their admiration, neighbors thanked me for speaking out, and strangers wrote to say they had faced similar situations. It became clear that our story, while painful, had the power to educate and protect others. Sometimes, when the evening sun cast a golden glow over the porch, I would sit quietly and think about the woman who had tried to deceive us. I didn't feel fear anymore. I didn't even feel anger as sharply as before. Instead, I felt a mixture of reflection and acceptance. She had been a moment in our lives, a test of resilience, a reminder that love and truth are stronger than any lie. Life in Willow Creek gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm. Friends came for dinner, neighbors stopped by for tea, and Margaret and I continued to nurture our home. The memories of my husband remained intact, untouched by fraud or deceit. His presence was in every photograph, every chair in the living room, every familiar scent of home-cooked meals. And as the shadow of the impostor had faded, her story remained a cautionary tale that I carried gently in my heart. It reminded me to trust my instincts, to protect what matters, and to believe that even in the face of deceit, the truth will eventually surface. In quiet moments, I would sometimes imagine her far away, trying the same tactics on someone else. I hoped she had learned her lesson, though I doubted it. My concern was no longer fear for ourselves. It was a gentle, reflective acknowledgement of the strange, human capacity for deception. Margaret and I began focusing more on the future, small projects around the house, community gatherings, and volunteer work. Life had taught me that even after betrayal, there is room for renewal. There is room for love, for laughter, and for trust to be rebuilt carefully and intentionally. And so, as the seasons changed, as the sun rose and set over Willow Creek, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not over the impostor, not in revenge, but in reclaiming our lives, our home, and our peace of mind. We had survived deceit, navigated fear, and come out stronger on the other side. I understood finally that trust, once tested and shaken, could be restored with patience, vigilance, and love. And though we would never forget the lessons learned from that woman who cried at my husband's funeral, we were free to continue our lives without her shadow looming over us. After the courtroom, Willow Creek seemed quieter, but the story of the impostor continued to ripple through the town. The woman who had cried at my husband's funeral became a cautionary tale, whispered about in the aisles of the grocery store, at church gatherings, and in backyard conversations. People were shocked, yes, but they were also fascinated by the audacity of someone who could so convincingly insert herself into another family's grief. Despite the exposure, the woman tried to salvage her image. She claimed she had been misunderstood, that people had jumped to conclusions, that her intentions had been honest. But the evidence was overwhelming. Frank's meticulous investigation, the DNA results, the forged documents, they left no room for doubt. The court imposed strict penalties, restitution to cover legal costs, fines for fraud, and a mandate to cease all contact with our family. But the real punishment came in the form of public humiliation. Newspapers printed her story, with photographs of her appearing at our local church and at the courthouse. People who had once felt sympathy for her now shook their heads in disbelief. Her reputation, built on tears and deception, crumbled within days. I remember the first time I walked past the local cafe after the verdict. Strangers stopped me to say, "I can't believe someone could do that," or "You handled it so well." Their words were comforting, a balm to the lingering fear I had carried. But there was also a subtle shift in the town's atmosphere, an acknowledgement that deceit can exist even in the most familiar corners of our lives. Margaret and I used this opportunity to talk openly about boundaries, trust, and vigilance. We shared our experience with friends and neighbors, not as a warning born of bitterness, but as a lesson in awareness. It was empowering to know that by speaking out, we could prevent others from falling victim to similar schemes. At home, life slowly returned to a gentle rhythm. The house, once heavy with tension, became a sanctuary again. I would often sit on the porch, watching the sunlight dance across the garden Margaret had tended, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in weeks. Each flower, each familiar object, reminded me that our lives had been restored. Yet, even in tranquility, reflections lingered. I thought about the woman, about her ability to manipulate grief, to weave herself into the fabric of a family's life. It was unsettling, but it was also a reminder of the importance of trusting one's instincts. From the very first moment, when I felt unease at her presence, my gut had been right. It had guided me through fear, uncertainty, and deception. The community's response was mixed, as is often the case in small towns. Some neighbors were quick to judge her harshly, others were more reflective, considering how desperation and loneliness might drive someone to such lengths. I understood both perspectives. There was no excuse for her actions, but there was also a lesson in empathy, not for her, but for ourselves and the people around us. I started attending more community events, speaking gently about our experience. At a women's circle at the local library, I shared how easily grief can be exploited and the importance of vigilance. The women listened with rapt attention, nodding in recognition. Some shared their own stories of fraud, of distant relatives or strangers who had tried to insert themselves into their lives. Our shared experiences became a network of awareness, a safety net for the town. Margaret and I also revisited our personal lives, focusing on joy and healing. We organized family dinners, invited friends over for tea, and spent time outdoors, reconnecting with the simple pleasures that had been overshadowed by deceit. The impostor's shadow had been long, but it could not erase the love, laughter, and memories that filled our home. There were moments of quiet reflection, too. Late at night, I would sit by the window, looking at the stars and thinking about the fragility of trust. I thought about how easily someone could attempt to take what is not their own, and yet how resilience, courage, and truth could withstand even the most calculated deception. I also thought about my husband. Though he was gone, his presence remained in every corner of the house, in every memory, in every lesson he had taught me. He had always valued honesty, kindness, and integrity. In a strange way, the impostor had reinforced the importance of these values. Her deceit had forced me to act with vigilance, to seek truth relentlessly, and to protect the legacy of our family. The legal closure was important, but the emotional closure was equally vital. Margaret and I began journaling again, recording our memories, our feelings, and the lessons we had learned. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to reclaim our narrative. Each word, each sentence reinforced that our life, our story, and our love could not be stolen. The impostor eventually moved out of town, but her story remained a topic of discussion. People who had initially doubted me now approached with respect and support. I realized that surviving such an ordeal not only restores trust in oneself, but also earns a quiet respect from the wider community. Sometimes I would think about the hypothetical. What if I hadn't trusted my instincts? What if I had handed over the house without question? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. But I used it as motivation to educate others. In conversations at church or during community gatherings, I would gently remind people, always trust your instincts, verify documents, and never let grief blind you to potential deceit. Margaret became my confidant in every sense, her calm presence a shield against lingering fears. We spoke often about boundaries, about being aware of the people we allowed into our lives. Our conversations were never about suspicion for its own sake. They were about empowerment, awareness, and careful trust. One day, as we were organizing photographs from decades past, I realized that life had returned to its rhythm. The impostor was no longer a presence, not even in memory, except as a reminder of vigilance. The house was filled with laughter again. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread, and the garden bloomed in colors that mirrored the warmth returning to our lives. In the quiet moments, I would sometimes imagine the woman far away, no longer able to deceive or threaten. She had been a test, a challenge, and in facing her, we had grown stronger. I understood that trust is fragile, but not fragile enough to be broken by someone else's lies. Finally, I came to a place of peace. Our family had survived deception, intimidation, and fear, we had emerged resilient, our lives intact, and our hearts stronger. The impostor's schemes had failed, not because of luck, but because of vigilance, truth, and the unwavering bond of family. I learned to value the small moments, the shared laughter over a cup of tea, the warmth of a hand held during uncertain times, the peace of a home that is truly yours. These moments, more than anything, are what define a life. And so, as the sun set over Willow Creek, casting golden light across our garden, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for my family, for friends, for the strength to confront deceit, and for the lessons learned. Life will continue, as it always does, and though shadows may pass through our lives, they can never extinguish the light of truth, love, and integrity. The months following the impostor's exposure were filled with quiet healing. Willow Creek gradually returned to its gentle rhythm, the whispers in the grocery store and at church replaced by familiar greetings and shared laughter. Margaret and I spent more time together than ever, not just repairing the home, but repairing the sense of safety that had been shaken by someone's deceit. I often sat on the porch in the early mornings, the air cool with dew, sipping tea while listening to the birds sing. Each chirp felt like a small reassurance. Life goes on, and with it comes clarity. I reflected on how fragile trust can be, yet how resilient it is when grounded in awareness, love, and vigilance. The impostor's actions had tested my instincts, my patience, and my resolve. In facing her, I discovered strengths I didn't fully know I had. Neighbors, once hesitant, returned to visit with warmth. Some came to hear the story firsthand, curious about how deception could creep into a life so ordinary. Others simply came to enjoy tea, to share stories, and to be reminded of the value of community. The impostor's attempt to claim our home had inadvertently strengthened the bonds we shared with friends and neighbors. Margaret and I began keeping a more careful record of our documents and memories. We scanned old letters, organized photographs, and stored important papers in secure locations. It was not paranoia, it was prudence. The ordeal had shown us that even in a loving community, vigilance is necessary. We wanted our home, our memories, and our legacy protected from anyone who might try to disrupt them in the future. One afternoon, as I walked through the garden, I noticed the tulips Margaret had planted after the trial. Their bright colors were a reminder that life continues, even after fear and deceit. I knelt to touch the petals and thought of my husband. His presence was in every corner of the house, every photograph on the wall, every familiar scent of home-cooked meals. The impostor could never touch that. The town, too, had absorbed lessons from the ordeal. People became more cautious, but also more supportive. Conversations in the market, at church, and at community events often revolved around the importance of checking documents, verifying claims, and trusting one's instincts. Our story, once painful, had become a tool to educate and protect others. I found comfort in knowing that our experience could help someone else from being deceived in the same way. Despite the resolution, I still thought about the impostor occasionally. I wondered where she had gone, what she had planned next, and whether she had learned anything from her actions. But I no longer feared her. Her power over my life had ended the day the truth was revealed, and with that truth came freedom. Margaret and I also focused on healing our emotional selves. We spent evenings together sharing stories, laughing over memories, and sometimes crying quietly about the fear we had endured. Those moments of openness strengthened our bond, reminding us that family is both a refuge and a source of resilience. I began writing letters to friends and distant relatives, recounting the experience with the intent to educate. I emphasized the importance of instincts, careful record-keeping, and protecting one's family from deception. The letters were met with gratitude and relief. Many had experienced similar situations, but lacked the courage or clarity to confront them. Sharing our story had transformed our pain into purpose. Evenings in our home regained their peaceful cadence. I would sit by the fireplace, listening to the crackle of the flames, and feel a sense of completeness. The impostor's shadow had long since disappeared, leaving space for love, laughter, and reflection. The home, once heavy with fear, was light again. Our neighbors noticed the change too. Children played freely in the yards, friends visited without hesitation, and the community became quietly stronger. It was as if the ordeal had reminded everyone that vigilance and trust must coexist, and that truth always prevails when approached with patience and care. I also took time to reflect on my own growth. Before the impostor arrived, I was trusting, perhaps even naive. I believed in the goodness of people and in the inherent honesty of those who came to us in grief. The experience taught me to balance that kindness with discernment. It was not about suspicion, it was about protecting the life I had built and the memories that mattered most. Margaret and I began planning small projects around the house, painting the porch, planting new flowers, reorganizing rooms. Each project became an affirmation of life, an act of reclaiming our space and our peace. The house, our home, was no longer a place of anxiety. It was a sanctuary of memories and love. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I hosted a small gathering for neighbors and friends. We shared tea and baked goods, laughter echoing in the warm air. Conversations turned to stories, advice, and gentle reminders about the importance of vigilance. I realized that our ordeal had transformed us into a source of guidance, a beacon for those who might face similar situations. The impostor, once a looming shadow, had become a distant memory. Her actions were recorded in court documents and local reports, but they no longer held sway over our daily lives. We had reclaimed our home, our memories, and our peace of mind. Sometimes, when I sit on the porch at sunset, I catch myself reflecting on the first day she appeared at the funeral. Her tears, her claims, her insistence, it all feels surreal now. Yet those memories serve as a reminder of the importance of listening to one's instincts, standing firm in the face of deception, and trusting in the love and strength of family. Margaret and I also focused on honoring my husband's memory more intentionally. We displayed photographs, shared stories with friends, and maintained the traditions he cherished. The home was once again filled with warmth, laughter, and the comfort of enduring love. As life in Willow Creek settled into its quiet rhythm, I understood the most important lesson from the ordeal. Trust, when combined with awareness and action, is unbreakable. The impostor had tried to manipulate grief and claim what was not hers, but she underestimated the strength of family, the clarity of instincts, and the power of truth. The community, too, had learned. People were more careful, more observant, yet more compassionate. Our story had become a gentle warning, a way to help others protect their lives, homes, and families. And in sharing it, I found a sense of purpose that extended beyond myself. In the evenings, Margaret and I would sometimes sit together in the garden, watching the sun set over the trees. The colors of the sky reminded me of resilience, of continuity, and of life's gentle persistence. Each day brought reassurance that despite fear and deceit, love and truth endure. Even now, years later, the memory of the impostor serves as a quiet guide. She reminded me that vigilance is essential, that instincts are invaluable, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act in spite of it. And so, as the seasons changed and our home filled with warmth, laughter, and love, I felt a deep sense of peace. The impostor had tried to claim our life, but she failed. Our home remained ours, our memories intact, and our family stronger than ever. The months that followed the impostor's exposure became a period of gentle restoration. Life in Willow Creek resumed its comforting rhythms. Morning coffee on the porch, neighbors stopping by to chat, children laughing in the yard. Yet beneath the everyday routines, Margaret and I carried the lessons of that turbulent time like precious, if painful, heirlooms. I often reflected on how quickly a stranger could slip into your life, seemingly with genuine grief and sorrow, and the ease with which deception could be woven into the fabric of everyday moments. The woman at my husband's funeral had appeared as someone I could trust, someone who shared my pain. Her tears, her quiet gestures of empathy, they were all carefully orchestrated to convince me that she belonged. And yet, I had learned that instincts matter. From the very first moment when something about her felt off, my intuition had been guiding me. I hadn't fully understood it then, but in hindsight, that subtle unease had been a warning. Listening to it, acting on it, and seeking the truth had saved our family and our home. Margaret and I grew closer during those months, strengthened by the shared ordeal. We spoke often about boundaries and awareness, but more importantly, we spoke about hope. Even after betrayal, there is room for trust, laughter, and love to flourish. It isn't a matter of forgetting what happened, but of choosing not to let fear define your life. Community engagement became another focus for us. Willow Creek had absorbed the lessons of our story, and we began participating more actively in local meetings and gatherings. We shared our experience, not to frighten, but to educate. At the library, during women's circles, even at the church, our story became a gentle lesson on vigilance, instincts, and protecting one's family. People listened closely, some nodding in recognition of past suspicions, others grateful for the guidance before it was too late. Through these conversations, I realized that our experience wasn't just about protecting our home, it was about fostering awareness and resilience in the community. A story that began in fear and deception had grown into a tool for empowerment. That realization brought a quiet sense of purpose, a reassurance that our ordeal, while painful, had meaning beyond our immediate family. Evenings in the home regained their warmth. Margaret and I would sit together in the garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the colors reflecting a gentle serenity. We laughed about small things, shared memories of my husband, and sometimes allowed ourselves quiet tears, ones born not of fear but of relief and gratitude. I also took time to chronicle our journey in letters and journals. I wrote about the impostor's deceit, the courtroom, the DNA results, and the emotional aftermath. But more than that, I wrote about the lessons we had learned, about trusting instincts, safeguarding what is yours, and facing challenges with courage. Those writings became a legacy I hoped to share with friends, family, and even strangers who might one day need guidance. Margaret and I found joy in small daily routines, tending to the garden, cooking meals together, and sitting on the porch in the cool morning air. The impostor's shadow had disappeared, replaced by memories of love, laughter, and the safety of a home restored. At times, I thought about the woman who had tried to deceive us. I wondered if she had reflected on her actions, if she had recognized the harm she caused. But I let those thoughts drift away. She no longer had power over us, and dwelling on her only distracted from the life we were reclaiming. Instead, I focused on what remained: our family, our friends, and the life we had built over decades. Each photograph, each letter, each shared meal was a testament to resilience, to love, and to the truth that cannot be stolen. The community's response reinforced that truth. Neighbors who had once whispered doubts now approached with respect and care. Parents taught their children about vigilance. Friends reminded one another of the importance of protecting memories and property. Our story had become a quiet guide, a reminder that even in small towns, deceit can appear, and yet it can be overcome with patience and resolve. I also reflected on how grief and trust intertwine. We had been mourning my husband when the impostor arrived, a period of vulnerability she exploited. The experience taught me that grief requires careful navigation, not only in mourning but in protecting oneself from those who might take advantage of it. It is a delicate balance, honoring memory while remaining aware, loving deeply while staying vigilant. Margaret and I continued to honor my husband's memory. We displayed photographs, shared stories with friends, and maintained the traditions he had cherished. These moments grounded us, reminding us that life, even after deceit and fear, can be filled with love and continuity. I found that the impostor, though once a figure of fear, had become a teacher in an unexpected way. Her audacity forced me to act, to uncover truth, and to defend my family. The ordeal revealed the importance of discernment, courage, and patience. And while I would not wish such an experience on anyone, I recognized its role in strengthening my instincts, my bonds, and my resilience. Margaret and I also took joy in passing these lessons forward. We spoke gently with younger neighbors, advised friends, and even shared our story with women's groups in nearby towns. The lessons of vigilance, trust, and courage resonated beyond our home. Our experience, though painful, had transformed into a gift, knowledge that could prevent others from falling prey to deception. In quiet moments, I sometimes imagined the impostor far away, stripped of power and influence. I hoped she had learned something about honesty and the limits of manipulation, though I did not dwell on it. My focus was on the life I had reclaimed, the love I continued to nurture, and the community that had supported me. Life in Willow Creek continued its peaceful rhythm. Neighbors visited more freely, children played safely, and the small routines of everyday life returned to their comforting cadence. The impostor's shadow had disappeared, replaced by memories of love, laughter, and the safety of a home restored. Finally, I understood that our ordeal had left us richer, not in wealth, but in awareness, resilience, and emotional strength. We had faced deception, intimidation, and public scrutiny, and yet our home, our memories, and our love endured. Looking back, I realized the true victory was not legal or material. It was the preservation of our family's integrity, the safeguarding of memories, and the restoration of trust in our lives. The impostor's attempts to steal what was ours had failed, and in their failure they had illuminated the enduring strength of truth, love, and vigilance. And so, life continued in Willow Creek, steady and serene. Margaret and I walked through the garden each morning, greeted neighbors, shared meals, and cherished the quiet moments that define a life well lived. The impostor, once a disruptive force, had become a reminder, a testament to the importance of instincts, courage, and the enduring power of love. As the seasons shifted, Willow Creek settled back into its gentle rhythm. The scandal of the impostor who had cried at my husband's funeral became part of town history, a story retold at church gatherings, library circles, and casual neighborly chats. Yet, for Margaret and me, the story had transformed into something deeper, a reflection on life, trust, and the power of resilience. In the quiet mornings on the porch, I often thought about the lessons the ordeal had taught me. At first, fear and betrayal had dominated my thoughts, but with time, reflection softened those edges. I began to see the impostor's deception not just as a threat, but as a mirror reflecting the importance of vigilance and intuition. It wasn't about dwelling on her actions, it was about understanding how easily deception could occur and how crucial it was to protect oneself and loved ones. Margaret and I discussed our experiences more openly now, exploring how the events had shaped us emotionally. We shared fears we hadn't voiced before, from the moments of disbelief at her audacity to the lingering unease in the days after the trial. Talking about these feelings was cathartic, allowing us to process emotions that had been buried beneath shock and anger. I realized that community support had been essential. Friends, neighbors, and even acquaintances had rallied quietly, offering encouragement, advice, and reassurance. Their presence reminded me that no matter how personal the challenge, shared humanity can provide strength. The impostor's deceit had isolated us temporarily, but it also revealed the value of connections built over decades of genuine care. The legal resolution had long been finalized, but its impact extended far beyond court documents. Our experience became a cautionary tale, emphasizing the necessity of verification, intuition, and careful observation. At the library, during a women's circle, I found myself speaking about these lessons to an attentive group of older women. They nodded knowingly, sharing stories of their own brushes with deception, lending a sense of shared understanding and collective wisdom. I also reflected on the subtle ways grief had been exploited. Losing my husband left a void, one that the impostor attempted to fill with her false claims. In those moments, I understood that vulnerability is natural, but it must be balanced with discernment. Grief teaches empathy, but it can also make us susceptible to manipulation. I shared this understanding with friends, emphasizing the importance of listening to intuition while navigating emotionally charged situations. Our home, once a place of tension, had returned to a sanctuary. Margaret and I spent hours tending the garden, arranging family photographs, and revisiting old letters. Every object, every memory was a reminder of what was genuine: love, connection, and shared history. The impostor's falsehoods could not erase the authenticity of our life together. The community gradually recognized our resilience. People approached us with admiration, acknowledging how we had confronted deceit with calm determination. Children in the neighborhood learned that boundaries and awareness matter, not in a fearful sense, but as an understanding that life is full of both kindness and caution. Willow Creek had absorbed our experience, turning a painful episode into a collective lesson in vigilance and trust. I also thought about the impostor herself. Though I had no desire for revenge, I reflected on her motivations and the emptiness behind her actions. She had sought to claim what wasn't hers, to insert herself into grief and manipulate emotions for gain. Her failure reminded me that authenticity, honesty, and love cannot be faked. They endure beyond deception. Margaret and I celebrated small victories too. Even mundane activities like baking cookies or rearranging the living room became acts of reclaiming our home. Each task reaffirmed that life moves forward and that joy can coexist with memory and reflection. We cherished these moments, understanding that the impostor could never infiltrate the spaces built on love and truth. I began to write more extensively, documenting the emotional journey as well as the practical lessons learned. I included details about the importance of verifying claims, trusting instincts, and protecting family and home. My hope was that others, especially older women navigating grief or vulnerability, could benefit from our story. Each letter, each journal entry became a record of resilience and wisdom. The seasons passed, and with them came quiet acceptance. The impostor's shadow receded, replaced by laughter, music, and shared meals. The home was alive again, filled with the scent of fresh bread, the warmth of sunlight through the windows, and the comfort of memories untouched by deceit. I often sat in the garden, Margaret beside me, watching the birds and listening to the rustle of leaves. It was in these moments of quiet reflection that I understood the deeper meaning of our experience. Life is a mix of vulnerability and strength, of loss and love. Deception may appear, grief may expose vulnerability, and fear may cloud judgment, but truth, integrity, and the bonds of family endure. Margaret and I spoke to younger family members about what had occurred, not to frighten them, but to educate them about the subtle ways people can exploit grief and trust. These conversations were measured and compassionate, focusing on lessons learned rather than fear. I wanted them to understand that instincts, vigilance, and careful attention to detail are as valuable as love and empathy. Margaret and I continued to honor my husband's memory. His photograph stood on the mantel, letters from decades past were carefully preserved, and his favorite chair remained in its place. These tangible reminders of the life we shared provided comfort and continuity. The impostor's deceit could not tarnish the truth of our love and our history together. In quiet evenings, I often reflected on how the experience had reshaped me. I had learned patience, discernment, and courage. I had discovered a deeper sense of self, strengthened by the trials we endured. I realized that life is full of unexpected challenges, and each one is an opportunity to grow, to teach, and to protect what truly matters. Margaret and I began volunteering occasionally at local organizations, sharing our story and its lessons with older women in particular. The impact was tangible. Women expressed gratitude, shared their own experiences, and left conversations feeling more empowered and aware. Our ordeal, once a source of fear, had become a gift in disguise, a way to educate, protect, and inspire others. Even simple routines took on new meaning. Cooking meals together, tending the garden, and reading letters from friends and family became acts of mindfulness and joy. Every day was a reminder that life, even after betrayal and fear, is filled with opportunities for connection, love, and reflection. I sometimes thought about the impostor's fate. The court had ensured legal consequences, but beyond that, she was no longer part of our lives. Her story became a distant cautionary tale, a reminder that deception exists, but cannot endure in the presence of truth, vigilance, and love. Willow Creek had healed alongside us. Neighbors returned to familiar routines, families shared meals and laughter, and community bonds grew stronger. Our story, once a source of fear, had become a collective lesson in resilience, trust, and awareness. Margaret and I spent long evenings reflecting on our journey. We spoke about fear, love, grief, and resilience. We acknowledged the pain caused by the impostor, but we also celebrated the strength and wisdom gained from confronting her. In these reflections, we found closure, not the end of memory, but the resolution of fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability. I understood, finally, that life is resilient. Deception may appear, grief may expose vulnerability, and fear may cloud judgment, but truth, integrity, and the bonds of family endure. Margaret and I had faced the unexpected, confronted betrayal, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected. The impostor's shadow no longer lingered. The home, the memories, and our hearts were ours to nurture, protect, and cherish. And in that realization, I found peace. Even though the court had ruled against her months ago, news of the impostor continued to circulate in Willow Creek. The town, initially shocked and saddened, now watched with a mixture of disbelief and quiet satisfaction as her deception was fully exposed to the public. Newspapers, online reports, and even community newsletters covered the story, documenting the extent of her audacity, how she had cried at my husband's funeral, claimed to be a widow and relative, and attempted to sell our home. It was surreal, seeing her face in print alongside details of her fraud. I had imagined this moment countless times during sleepless nights, wondering how her lies would finally be revealed to everyone. Now, the reality felt oddly satisfying, not out of malice, but as a confirmation that truth and vigilance prevail. Margaret and I attended a small local gathering at the community hall, where friends and neighbors discussed the lessons learned from our ordeal. I could see the ripple effect our story had created. People were more cautious, but also more supportive of one another. They shared their own experiences of deception and misrepresentation, realizing that the impostor's story was not just ours, but a universal warning about trust, grief, and vigilance. The impostor, meanwhile, tried to salvage whatever remained of her reputation. She appeared in courtrooms and local hearings, claiming misunderstandings, miscommunication, and ill intent from the community. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the fraudulent claims, and the DNA results left no room for excuses. Her attempts at public sympathy fell flat. People who had once been neutral or unsure now saw her as what she truly was, a calculated manipulator who preyed on grief. I remember the first time I walked past the local cafe after the news broke. Strangers approached me to say, "I can't believe she actually did that," or "You handled everything so well." Their words were a comforting acknowledgement that the truth had prevailed. Margaret squeezed my hand and we exchanged a knowing look. The ordeal had left us wary, yes, but it had also revealed the depth of support in our community. Over the following weeks, the impostor's attempts to reinsert herself into local affairs dwindled. Businesses refused to work with her, old acquaintances distanced themselves, and even those who had once offered a sympathetic ear now refused contact. It was as if the town itself had collectively decided to protect itself from further deception. At home, Margaret and I continued to focus on what mattered most: our family, our home, and the life we had rebuilt. Each day brought reassurance that the impostor could no longer threaten our peace. We walked through the garden, tended to flowers, and reminisced about memories that had nothing to do with deceit. Slowly, the shadow she had cast faded entirely. I also reflected on how this ordeal had changed me personally. I had learned to trust my instincts unconditionally, to act decisively when something felt off, and to seek help from experts when needed. Courage, I realized, is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. The impostor had tested my strength, and in overcoming her schemes, I had discovered resilience I didn't know I possessed. The community, too, had changed. People were more careful in their dealings, yes, but they were also more compassionate. There was a renewed sense of connection, neighbors checking in on each other, families sharing advice, and older women guiding younger women through financial and emotional decisions. Our story had sparked awareness, education, and even subtle empowerment. Even the courthouse staff remembered the case vividly. They often remarked on how unusual it was for someone to fabricate such an elaborate story so convincingly. Judges, lawyers, and clerks recounted the details with a mix of disbelief and admiration for the way we had handled the situation. Frank, the private investigator, became somewhat of a local hero, praised for his meticulous work that had brought irrefutable clarity to a confusing and emotionally charged situation. At home, Margaret and I took extra care in organizing our personal and legal documents, knowing that preparation is the best defense against future deception. We implemented small changes, locked cabinets, detailed records, and a habit of verifying any unfamiliar claims. These measures were not born of fear, but of prudence. One afternoon, as I organized photographs from decades past, I realized how much had changed. Life, even after betrayal, continued to be beautiful. Each picture, each memory, each corner of our home reminded me that the impostor could never touch the authenticity of our lives. Love, laughter, and shared experiences remained ours, untouched and genuine. The impostor eventually left Willow Creek entirely, her schemes dismantled, her reputation ruined. The town slowly moved past the incident, but the lessons endured. People discussed the importance of verification, trust in instincts, and community support. Our experience had become a reference point, a story told not to sensationalize but to educate and protect. Margaret and I also began documenting our journey more thoroughly. I wrote letters to friends, distant relatives, and even community organizations, detailing the experience and the practical lessons learned. These writings became a form of legacy, guidance for others who might face similar situations. The impostor's deception, once a source of fear, had been transformed into a source of wisdom. Even in the quiet of the evenings, the impact of the ordeal was clear. Margaret and I would sit together in the garden, watching the sunset, and reflect on the growth, awareness, and resilience that had emerged from our experience. The impostor's attempt to disrupt our lives had failed entirely, but the lessons she left behind would endure. The final public humiliation for the impostor brought an unexpected sense of closure. Her face in the newspapers, her fraudulent claims dissected in print, and the public acknowledgement of her deceit served as a symbolic resolution. Justice, in this sense, was not just legal, it was social, emotional, and communal. The community, Margaret, and I had reclaimed our narrative. We also celebrated small joys that had once been overshadowed by fear. Baking, gardening, and sharing meals with friends became acts of healing. Each ordinary day, once taken for granted, felt precious and affirming. The impostor had tried to steal that peace, but it remained ours, vibrant and intact. Margaret and I often spoke about the impostor not with anger, but with perspective. She had been a challenge, yes, but one that revealed strengths, taught lessons, and fostered connections. The experience reinforced the importance of vigilance, intuition, and courage. Most importantly, it reminded us that love and truth are enduring forces, impervious to deceit. By the time winter arrived, our home had fully reclaimed its warmth. Snow on the rooftops, fires in the fireplace, and the scent of baked goods filled the house. Life was calm, predictable in its gentle rhythms, yet rich with the knowledge of what we had overcome. The impostor was gone, but our resilience, love, and lessons remained, embedded in every corner of our home and in the hearts of those around us. The first spring after the impostor's final exposure was the most serene I had felt in years. Willow Creek was alive with soft breezes, flowering gardens, and the gentle hum of life reclaiming its rhythm. Margaret and I often walked through the town together, greeting neighbors with smiles and sharing laughter that felt freer than it had in months. The fear that had once shadowed our days was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that only comes from surviving something deeply unsettling. Our home, which had once felt vulnerable, was now a sanctuary. The porch, where I had sat countless mornings reflecting on grief and betrayal, became a place of joy again. I watched sunlight dance over the garden tulips and heard birds sing with the assurance that life, despite challenges, persists. The impostor could never take these simple, true pleasures from us. Margaret and I dedicated time to organizing our personal history, old photographs, letters, and mementos. Each item was a reminder of the life we had built and the memories that had been untouched by deceit. The process was almost meditative, a celebration of authenticity, continuity, and love. Our home, once a battlefield of suspicion, now felt alive with warmth and integrity. We also reached out to the community in meaningful ways. Invitations to women's groups, book clubs, and local gatherings became opportunities to share our story, not as a cautionary tale meant to scare, but as guidance for vigilance, trust, and emotional resilience. Women, particularly those who had faced loss or vulnerability, approached us quietly to express gratitude. Many confessed to similar experiences or near deceptions, admitting that hearing our story had given them courage to act wisely in their own lives. It became clear that our ordeal had a ripple effect. Willow Creek, once quiet and ordinary, now brimmed with awareness. People were careful but compassionate, empathetic but observant. Our experience, though painful, had strengthened the fabric of the community. It was a reminder that lessons learned through hardship could be shared to protect others, to teach vigilance without breeding fear. I often reflected on the impostor herself. While I no longer felt anger or resentment, I sometimes considered what had driven her to such audacity. Perhaps she had experienced desperation, loneliness, or greed, circumstances that do not excuse her actions, but perhaps explain them. These reflections helped me release the last traces of fear, transforming anger into understanding without condoning wrongdoing. Margaret and I also strengthened our routines of self-care and mindfulness. Mornings began with tea in the garden, the sun warming our faces, and evenings ended with quiet reflection or shared stories. The small rituals that had once seemed ordinary now felt sacred, affirming that life is precious and resilience is a daily practice. Our relationship, tested by fear and deception, had deepened immeasurably. Margaret became not only a partner in restoring our home, but a companion in understanding the human heart, its vulnerabilities, strengths, and capacity for love. We often discussed how grief, when coupled with intuition and vigilance, could be navigated without being consumed by it. I also took time to chronicle the experience in more detail. Letters, journals, and notes became a collection of lessons and reflections. I focused not just on what had happened, but on the emotional journey, the uncertainty, the fear, the empowerment, and the eventual peace. My hope was that these words would serve as a guide for others, particularly women who may face deception in vulnerable moments of their lives. Community bonds grew stronger as well. Neighbors stopped by more often, sharing meals, stories, and advice. There was a renewed sense of togetherness, a subtle acknowledgement that life is richer when vigilance and compassion coexist. Willow Creek had transformed into a town not just of residents, but of a connected, supportive community. The home itself became a symbol of resilience. Each room, each photograph, and each memory was a testament to survival, authenticity, and love. The impostor had attempted to disrupt our life, but she had failed. Every smile, every shared meal, and every quiet moment of reflection reinforced the permanence of what is real, cherished, and true. Margaret and I also began mentoring younger women in the town, teaching them practical lessons about safeguarding homes, managing documents, and trusting instincts. These sessions were gentle, empathetic, and educational, ensuring that our experience could help others navigate challenges without fear. The transformation from victimhood to mentorship became one of the most rewarding outcomes of the ordeal. Even the legal aftermath, while once heavy and stressful, now seemed distant. The court documents and rulings, while important, had served their purpose. The true victory lay in restored peace, strengthened relationships, and the knowledge that truth and vigilance had prevailed. Margaret and I often laughed quietly about how anxious we had been initially, realizing that our instincts had guided us more than we had fully appreciated at the time. Seasons continued to change, bringing new colors, scents, and rhythms to our days. I watched leaves fall and snow blanket the garden, feeling a deep sense of continuity and calm. Life, I realized, carries both challenges and joys, and how we navigate them defines our resilience. The impostor's actions tested us, but ultimately they had illuminated the strength of love, truth, and vigilance. We also continued small traditions to honor my husband's memory. Photographs were displayed with care, stories were recounted during quiet evenings, and his favorite meals were prepared for friends and family. These acts were more than nostalgia. They were affirmations that life, even after deception and loss, could remain rich with love, memory, and purpose. Margaret and I reflected often on how grief, fear, and love are intertwined. The impostor had taken advantage of our grief, but through vigilance, community support, and courage, we had reclaimed our life. I shared this perspective with friends and younger women in town, emphasizing that vulnerability is natural, but preparation, discernment, and intuition are crucial. The home itself became a haven. Rooms once shadowed with fear now resonated with warmth, laughter, and the scent of home-cooked meals. Even ordinary days became celebrations of resilience and love. Every photograph, every letter, every corner of the house testified to the authenticity of our lives. We also found joy in simple, everyday activities, tending the garden, walking through the neighborhood, baking treats for friends. These routines became acts of mindfulness and gratitude. Each moment reminded us that the impostor's actions could not take away the beauty, love, and resilience we had built over decades. The community's respect and support were constant reminders of what had been preserved and strengthened. People admired our composure, our patience, and our courage. Children learned subtle lessons about vigilance and trust, and adults appreciated the wisdom imparted through our story. Willow Creek had absorbed our ordeal and grown wiser, more cautious, but also more compassionate. Margaret and I often reflected on how the impostor's attempt, though frightening, had inadvertently strengthened our lives. It had tested our instincts, patience, and courage, but we had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected. The experience was a reminder that even in the face of deception, love and truth endure. Evenings became a time of reflection and gratitude. Sitting together in the garden, watching sunsets, and sharing memories, we felt a profound sense of closure. The impostor's shadow no longer touched our lives. Instead, the lessons learned, the bonds strengthened, and the wisdom gained became our enduring legacy. And so, life continued, peaceful, joyful, and rich with meaning. Margaret and I had not only survived deception, but transformed it into a source of empowerment, education, and emotional growth. The impostor's attempts had failed, but the love, vigilance, and resilience we cultivated had prevailed. By the time summer arrived in Willow Creek, Margaret and I felt an unshakable sense of stability and empowerment. The impostor's schemes had faded into memory, replaced by gratitude for life, family, and the supportive community around us. The town had absorbed the story, learning from our ordeal, and our experiences had become part of a subtle but important legacy, a cautionary tale with lessons for vigilance, trust, and resilience. Morning routines, once interrupted by anxiety, returned to their peaceful rhythms. I poured tea for Margaret as sunlight filtered through the curtains, the garden alive with blooming flowers and the quiet hum of bees. These small, ordinary moments carried the weight of victory. They were proof that life, even after deception, could be calm, safe, and joyful. We often reflected on how the ordeal had changed us. Beyond the initial shock, anger, and betrayal, there was now clarity. We understood that vulnerability is natural, especially in grief, but awareness and discernment are essential shields. Through our experience, we had learned not only how to protect ourselves, but how to empower others to do the same. Our conversations often turned to community and connection. Friends and neighbors would stop by, curious to hear more about the events and the lessons learned. These conversations were gentle but meaningful, a chance to share practical wisdom about safeguarding property, verifying claims, and trusting instincts. We were no longer victims, we had become teachers, mentors, and sources of guidance. The impostor, now a distant figure, had inadvertently provided an important reminder. People often present themselves convincingly, and appearances can be deceptive. But vigilance, careful observation, and courage can protect against even the most audacious schemes. We spoke about these truths openly, particularly to women who might find themselves vulnerable during times of grief or transition. Margaret and I also focused on celebrating life. Our home, once tense and fraught with uncertainty, became vibrant again. We tended to the garden, organized family photographs, and cooked meals that reminded us of decades of love, laughter, and shared memories. Every corner of the house, every familiar object, testified to the authenticity and permanence of what truly mattered. Community gatherings became an opportunity to share wisdom more formally. At the library, during women's circles, and in neighborhood meetings, we recounted our story with care, emphasizing practical lessons without sensationalism. Women listened intently, sharing their own experiences and asking questions. The sense of connection, mutual support, and empowerment was palpable. Evenings were spent reflecting on growth and resilience. Sitting together on the porch, Margaret and I discussed the transformation in ourselves and our community. The impostor's shadow no longer loomed. Instead, we saw clearly the strength we had gained. Awareness, courage, and love had triumphed over deception, leaving us with confidence and peace. I also took time to write extensively, chronicling the experience for posterity. Journals, letters, and reflections detailed both the emotional journey and the practical lessons learned. I wanted others, particularly older women, to understand that while grief can expose vulnerability, it can also teach resilience, insight, and the importance of trusting one's instincts. Margaret and I frequently revisited the importance of personal empowerment. By remaining calm, seeking help from experts, and relying on our intuition, we had protected our home, our family, and our dignity. These lessons extended beyond the immediate ordeal. They were strategies for life, applicable to a wide range of challenges. The community, too, had grown stronger. Neighbors supported one another, shared advice, and remained observant without becoming fearful. Conversations about vigilance were balanced with empathy, and people learned to navigate social interactions with both kindness and awareness. Our story had transformed from a source of fear to a beacon of practical guidance. I often reflected on the impostor's audacity. She had sought to exploit grief, manipulate emotions, and claim what was not hers, but her efforts had failed completely. The legal system, community awareness, and our own vigilance ensured that she could not succeed. And yet, reflecting on her motives allowed me to release lingering resentment, replacing anger with understanding. While her actions were wrong, they had inadvertently strengthened our resolve, awareness, and sense of self. Margaret and I also focused on strengthening our routines and household systems. Documentation was organized meticulously, records carefully maintained, and communication with family and friends became more intentional. These measures were not born of fear, but of prudence, a recognition that preparation is a lasting form of empowerment. Even small daily activities became affirmations of life reclaimed. Baking, gardening, walking through the neighborhood, and sharing meals were no longer simple routines, they were celebrations of resilience and authenticity. The impostor's attempts could never infiltrate these moments. They were ours to enjoy, fully and without concern. Community acknowledgement of our resilience further reinforced a sense of closure. Friends and neighbors expressed admiration for the way we had navigated the ordeal with patience, courage, and intelligence. Children learned lessons about discernment and safety, while adults appreciated the practical wisdom we shared. Willow Creek had absorbed our experience, transforming it into a collective understanding that vigilance and compassion can coexist. I often thought about how life had shifted in subtle but profound ways. Fear and uncertainty had given way to confidence and joy. Vulnerability had been met with awareness, deception had been met with action, and grief had been met with love and resilience. Every challenge faced had become a stepping stone towards empowerment. Margaret and I also made a point of celebrating the victories that were once taken for granted. Family gatherings, meals shared with friends, and quiet evenings by the fire were no longer routine. They were moments of triumph over fear and manipulation. Every smile, laugh, and shared story became a testament to life reclaimed and trust restored. Even in reflection, I understood that the impostor's presence had offered an unexpected gift: clarity. She had forced me to recognize the strength of intuition, the importance of seeking help, and the value of standing firm in the face of audacity. These lessons extended far beyond the immediate danger. They were tools for navigating life, relationships, and unexpected challenges. Our home became a symbol of resilience and love. Each room, photograph, and corner reinforced the permanence of authenticity. The impostor's deception had attempted to disrupt our lives, but the love, vigilance, and courage that Margaret and I cultivated remained untouchable. We also shared these insights with younger generations. Conversations with grandchildren, nieces, and neighbors emphasized practical steps to protect themselves, while also nurturing emotional intelligence and empathy. The story of the impostor became a framework for understanding both human kindness and human cunning, and how to navigate both wisely. The personal empowerment Margaret and I experienced extended to our relationships. Bonds with family, friends, and community members deepened as a result of shared experience, mutual support, and collective resilience. Awareness and empathy grew side by side, reinforcing trust and understanding. I often reflected how grief, vulnerability, and love are interconnected. The impostor had sought to exploit grief, but through awareness and courage, we had reclaimed control. Our experience reinforced the enduring truth that love and vigilance, when combined, create a formidable shield against deception. Margaret and I continued to honor my husband's memory. Photographs were displayed with care, letters preserved, and traditions maintained. These rituals provided continuity, stability, and emotional grounding, ensuring that the impostor's attempts at disruption had no lasting impact on the heart of our home. Evenings became sacred spaces of reflection and gratitude. Sitting together in the garden, we watched the sun set, feeling the security and warmth of life restored. The impostor's shadow had faded completely, leaving clarity, empowerment, and peace in its place. And so, as the town of Willow Creek moved through another season, Margaret and I embraced the lasting sense of triumph over deception. The impostor, once a source of fear,